It's June 14th, 2026. In the last 72 hours, something happened that nobody in the mainstream media is connecting the dots on properly, and I want to make sure you understand exactly what just went down and exactly why it matters so much more than the individual headlines are telling you. Because here's the thing about corners. When you back something into a corner, you do not do it with one punch. You do it with a combination. You do it with pressure from every direction simultaneously over a sustained period of time until the thing in the corner runs out of room to move and runs out of options to fight back with and has nowhere left to go except through you or to the table. And right now, today, June 14th, 2026, that is exactly where Iran's mullahs find themselves. Backed into a corner, out of room, and the combination of devastating U.S. weapons, an iron naval blockade that has cost Iran an estimated $4. $8 billion in lost oil revenue by May 1st alone, a systematically dismantled military machine that has lost 158 naval vessels, a destroyed air defense network, a depleted ballistic missile stockpile, and nuclear facilities buried under hundreds of meters of collapsed granite has finally forced the moment that everyone has been watching for since February 28th. Pakistan's Prime Minister announced on June 12th that the US and Iran have agreed on the final text of a peace deal. President Trump posted on Truth Social that the deal was scheduled to be signed on Sunday. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi confirmed on state television that a memorandum of understanding could be signed remotely in the coming days. And the naval blockade, Trump said clearly, will remain in full force and effect until the transaction is finalized. So today, we are going full afterburner on how we got here, what devastating U.S. weapons actually forced the mullahs into that corner, why the blockade is the single most powerful weapon in the entire U.S. arsenal in this conflict, and what the deal that appears to be on the table actually means for Iran, for the region, and for the world. And then stay about 3/4 of the way through because we have a massive global roundup on what Pakistan brokering this deal means for the balance of power in South Asia and the broader Indo-Pacific. And then the 40 chess section, where I give you my complete read on whether this deal actually holds or whether we are watching the opening act of something much longer. Let us go. So, to understand how the mullahs ended up in this corner, you have to understand where they started and how far they have fallen since February 28th, because the distance between where Iran was and where Iran is right now is genuinely staggering. When this conflict began, Iran had the largest ballistic missile stockpile in the Middle East. Estimates put it at somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 ballistic missiles of various ranges and capabilities. It had the Bavar 373 air defense system, its domestically produced answer to the Russian S-300, defending its most critical facilities. It had a functioning blue water naval capability, including frigates, submarines, and a fleet of fast attack boats in the Strait of Hormuz. It had a nuclear program with 972 pounds of uranium enriched to 60%, a short technical step from weapons grade, buried in hardened underground facilities at Fordo, Isfahan, and Natanz. It had a proxy network stretching from Hezbollah in Lebanon to Hamas in Gaza, to the Houthis in Yemen, to various Shia militia groups in Iraq and Syria, and it had what it believed was the ultimate deterrent card, the ability to close the Strait of Hormuz and threaten 20% of the world's daily oil supply. That was Iran on February 27th, 2026. And then Operation Epic Fury kicked off. And the combination of US and Israeli air power, the most capable strike package assembled since the Gulf War, began the systematic destruction of every single one of those pillars simultaneously. The nuclear facilities got hit with GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators dropped from B-2 Spirit stealth bombers. The Bavar 373 batteries got hunted down and destroyed by F-16CJ Wild Weasels firing AGM-88 HARM anti-radiation missiles. The ballistic missile infrastructure got struck repeatedly, production facilities, storage bunkers, launch sites, and the petrochemical plants that supply the propellants and precursors those missiles need to exist. 158 Iranian naval vessels got destroyed. And the Strait of Hormuz, the card Iran thought was its ultimate deterrent, became the stage for a demonstration of U.S. naval dominance so comprehensive and so one-sided that it should be studied in every naval war college on the planet for the next 50 years. That is the combination that backed the mullahs into the corner. Not one weapon, not one strike. The combination applied relentlessly. Over more than 100 days. Now let me talk about the specific devastating weapons that did the most work in forcing this outcome, because this is the technical heart of the story. And this is where I want to spend real time. Because when people say devastating U.S. weapons, they often think about the most visible things, the explosions, the missile intercepts, the dramatic footage. But the weapons that actually force the mullahs into this corner are more varied and more interesting than just the things that make the biggest fireballs. The first devastating weapon is the one that most people never even think of as a weapon. the U.S. naval blockade itself. Starting April 13th, the United States imposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports, preventing ships from transiting out of Iranian ports through the Strait of Hormuz. And the numbers here are almost incomprehensible in their scale and their speed of effect. The U.S. Department of Defense estimated that by May 1st, just 18 days into the blockade, Iran had already lost $8 billion in oil revenue. That is not a monthly number. That is 18 days. Before the conflict, Iran was earning approximately $500 million per day from oil exports flowing through the strait. The blockade turned that off like a light switch. The World Trade Organization reported a 95% reduction in ships carrying crude oil to and from Persian Gulf ports, and a 99% reduction in ships carrying LNG since the conflict began. 99%. The International Maritime Organization reported that approximately 20,000 mariners and 2,000 ships were stranded in the Persian Gulf at the peak of the crisis. The UAE's state-owned oil company estimated that full flows through Hormuz would not resume until 2027, even if a deal was reached quickly. That is the economic devastation that the blockade delivered, and it is the single most powerful tool in the U.S. arsenal in this conflict, because it does not require a single additional bomb to be dropped. It just requires the U.S. Navy to maintain its presence and its posture. And Iran's economy does the rest of the work of collapsing on its own. Iran's currency entered a free fall after the conflict began. Protests that started on December 28, 2025, spread across the country in January and February of 2026 at the encouragement of the United States. And the Mullahs, who have spent decades telling the Iranian people that their hardship is caused by foreign aggression, then by the regime's own choices, suddenly found themselves governing an economy in freefall with no military capability left to project strength and no way to feed the narrative of resistance when the reality of collapse was impossible to hide. That is a corner. That is what a corner actually looks like from the inside. The second devastating weapon is the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator. And I want to talk about this weapon in detail because it is the weapon that changed the entire strategic calculus of the Iranian nuclear program and therefore changed the entire negotiating dynamic of this conflict. The GBU-57 is the largest conventional weapon in the United States military inventory. It weighs 30,000 pounds. It is delivered exclusively by the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber because nothing else in the U.S. inventory can carry it. It is designed from the ground up to penetrate deep underground before detonating, defeating hardened and deeply buried targets that no other conventional weapon can reach. Iran spent decades and billions of dollars building its nuclear facilities deep underground precisely because it calculated that no conventional weapon could reach them. Fordo was built into a mountain with hundreds of feet of rock overhead, specifically to survive an Israeli or American strike. Iran thought that calculation was correct. The GBU-57 proved that calculation catastrophically wrong. The B-2s dropped GBU-57s on Fordo, on Isfahan, and on Natanz, and the tunnel systems collapsed. The uranium enrichment infrastructure was buried. The 972 pounds of 60% enriched uranium that Iran thought was its ultimate leverage, its permanent negotiating chip, the thing it believed guaranteed its relevance in any future deal, got entombed under hundreds of meters of granite. And the CIA Director John Ratcliffe confirmed that the damage to the nuclear facilities would take years for Iran to rebuild. Years, not months, years. So when Iran comes to the negotiating table and the deal framework includes, as CNN reported on June 12th, the complete dismantling of Iran's nuclear program, and the United States obtaining Iran's enriched material, that is not Iran making a strategic choice from a position of strength. That is Iran formalizing the physical reality that the GBU-57 already created. The weapon forced the outcome before the diplomats ever sat down. That is what devastating actually means. The third devastating weapon is the combination of F-35 stealth fighters and EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft working together as a team, because this combination is what made Iran's air defenses, which were genuinely formidable before this conflict, completely irrelevant throughout it. The F-35 operating in Iranian airspace is essentially invisible to Iran's radar systems. It uses the specific shaping and radar-absorbing materials that scatter and absorb the radar frequencies that Iran's fire control systems depend on. So, from Iran's perspective, the F-35 is a ghost. The radar shows nothing. The threat warning system shows nothing. And then the bomb lands. And then the EA-18G Growler layers on top of that by jamming the communications and radar systems that the surviving elements of Iran's air defense network are trying to use to coordinate a response. So Iran's radars that do try to come online to search for incoming aircraft immediately get flooded with jamming so powerful that their screens turn to static. The combination of the F-35 being invisible and the Growler making the defensive radar picture useless meant that U.S. strike packages flew into Iranian airspace with a level of freedom that is genuinely unprecedented in the history of modern warfare against a country with a serious air defense architecture. And every time a strike package went in and came back out without incident, every time a B-2 dropped GBU-57s on a facility Iran thought was protected, every time an F-15E Strike Eagle put a bunker buster through the roof of a missile storage facility and flew home without a scratch, the psychological effect on Iranian military leadership compounded. Because there is something uniquely demoralizing about an adversary that can reach you anywhere, anytime, against which your defenses are functionally useless and from which you cannot hide. That is the corner. That is what the weapons built together over more than 100 days. And then the fourth devastating weapon is the one that Iran tried to use against itself, but that actually accelerated its own path into the corner, and that is the ballistic missile. Because Iran spent years building its ballistic missile stockpile as its primary deterrent and its primary retaliatory tool, and throughout this conflict, it has been burning through that stockpile at a rate that it simply cannot sustain. Every time Iran launched ballistic missiles at U.S. bases in Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, it was expending irreplaceable inventory. And the interception rates achieved by the layered U.S. and Gulf partner air defense architecture, THAAD at high altitude, Patriot PAC-3 in the mid-layer, or Aegis destroyers with standard missiles engaging targets in the boost phase, were so consistently high, approaching 90 to 92% across the entire campaign, that Iran was burning through its most valuable military assets and achieving essentially nothing in exchange. The missile that hit and wounded 5 Americans on May 28th was the exception that proved the rule. And even in that case, the missile was intercepted. It was the debris that caused the casualties. Iran launched ballistic missiles to show it was strong. The interception rates showed the opposite. And then CENTCOM went after the production infrastructure, the petrochemical plants like the one in Mashhar that we covered in a previous video, the facilities that supply the propellants and precursors, without which Iran cannot build replacement missiles. So not only was Iran burning through its stockpile faster than it could be replaced, the U.S. was simultaneously destroying the industrial capacity to replace it. That is a double compression, inventory going down, replacement rate going down, and the remaining inventory getting less strategically valuable with every salvo that gets intercepted at a 90+% rate. That combination forced the mullahs to the table faster than any single weapon could have done alone. All right, you made it to the global roundup section. And today I want to talk about Pakistan because Pakistan brokering this deal is one of the most significant geopolitical developments of the entire conflict, and nobody is giving it the attention it deserves. Pakistan has been the mediating party throughout the ceasefire and negotiation process. The ceasefire announced on April 8th was mediated by Pakistan. The Islamabad talks on April 11th and 12th, which collapsed without an agreement at the time, were hosted by Pakistan. And now, on June 12th, it is Pakistan's Prime Minister who announced that the US and Iran have agreed on the final text of a peace deal. Pakistan sitting at this table is not accidental, and it is not incidental. Pakistan is a nuclear-armed Muslim-majority nation with deep historical ties to both Iran and the Gulf Arab states. It has a relationship with the United States that is complicated but functional. And it has a relationship with China that is close and strategically important. Pakistan brokering this deal positions Islamabad as a serious player in the diplomacy of the broader Muslim world and as a credible intermediary between the United States and nations that do not have direct diplomatic relations with Washington. That is a significant upgrade to Pakistan's regional standing, and it is one that has implications for how Pakistan navigates its own complicated position between the United States, China, India, and the broader Islamic world going forward. And from the U.S. perspective, having Pakistan as the mediating party rather than, say, Oman, which hosted earlier rounds of talks, gives the deal a different kind of regional legitimacy. It signals to the broader Muslim world that this was not a deal imposed by a tiny Gulf monarchy beholden to Western interests, but rather a deal mediated by the largest Muslim majority nation in the world, with genuine standing across the Islamic world. That framing matters for whether the deal holds domestically inside Iran, because the mullahs cannot sell a deal brokered by Oman to their base as easily as they can sell a deal brokered by Pakistan. And that brings us to the 40 Chess Strategic Analysis section, and here is my honest and complete read of where we are and what I think happens next. The deal framework, as reported by CNN on June 12th, includes the complete reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, the lifting of the U.S. blockade on Iranian ports, and the dismantling of Iran's nuclear program, including the United States, obtaining Iran's enriched material. Iran's foreign minister said the strait would not return to how it operated before the war, and that Iran would charge service fees rather than tolls for transit. The memorandum of understanding, if signed, would trigger a 60-day period of technical negotiations. And crucially, the question of whether Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the assassinated Ali Khamenei, has personally signed off on the agreement, has not been directly answered by Iranian officials. Now that unsigned question is the most important detail in this entire story, because the deal framework looks workable from a U.S. perspective. Zero nuclear enrichment, enriched material handed over, strait reopened, blockade lifted. That is a significant set of Iranian concessions. And on the U.S. side, the blockade getting lifted gives Iran's economy the oxygen it desperately needs. That is the trade. Iranian nuclear capability dismantled. Iranian economy gets to breathe. But here is the structural problem that every analyst covering this conflict has to grapple with honestly. Iran has violated every ceasefire that has been announced since April 8th. The first ceasefire was announced. Iran kept restricting passage through the strait. The ceasefire, nominally in place through June, has been violated repeatedly with drone launches, ballistic missile salvos, strikes on Gulf partner nations, and the shooting down of a U.S. Apache helicopter that triggered the 49 Tomahawk response. Every time a ceasefire was announced, Iran used the pause to try to reconstitute capabilities, restock, and then resume operations. So the question of whether a signed memorandum of understanding produces a different outcome than any of the previous ceasefire announcements depends entirely on whether the military and economic pressure that forced Iran to this point continues to be felt as a credible deterrent after the MOU is signed, or whether signing the MOU gives Iran the political cover to stop the bleeding temporarily while waiting for the pressure to ease. And that is why Trump's statement is so critically important. The naval blockade will remain in full force in effect until the transaction is finalized, not until the MOU is signed. Until the transaction is finalized, that framing suggests that the blockade, the most devastating economic weapon in the U.S. arsenal, does not go away on the day of the signature. It goes away when the technical negotiations produce a final verified agreement, which means Iran does not get the oxygen it needs until it has fully complied with the terms, not just agreed to them on paper. That is smart. That is the right way to structure a deal with a regime that has a documented history of agreeing to terms and then finding creative ways to not comply with them. And that is the corner that the devastating U.S. weapons and the blockade built together. Not just a military corner, a verified compliance corner, where the pressure stays on until the behavior changes, where the oxygen stays off until the enriched material is actually handed over. That is a corner that is very hard to escape from by talking your way out. You have to actually do the thing you agreed to do. And that, for the first time in the decades-long history of confrontation between the United States and the Iranian regime, might actually be the situation we are in right now. Mark it down. And watch the next 72 hours very closely. Because if that MOU gets signed and the blockade stays in place until full compliance, what the devastating U.S. weapons just built is not just a corner. It is a cage with a door that only opens from the outside. And America is holding the key. So what do you think? Do you think the deal actually gets signed this weekend, or do you think Iran finds a way to walk it back at the last second, the way it has walked back every previous agreement? Do you think the 60-day technical negotiation period produces a final verified deal, or does it become another stalling tactic? And do you think the blockade staying in place until finalization is the right call, or do you think Trump should ease it earlier as a goodwill gesture to bring Iran over the line? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Follow me on X for real-time analysis on breaking events like this because this story is moving fast, and I am posting updates there as they happen. Follow me on Instagram. And pop over to Pepperbox for content that goes deeper than anything I can post on the main platforms. Thanks so much for watching. This is Your Name, signing off. I could just imagine the mullah sitting in the corner of his office right now, literally in the corner, which is fitting, because that is exactly where he is strategically. His aide walks in and goes, "Sir, Pakistan says the Americans are ready to sign on Sunday." And the mullah looks up and says, "And the blockade?" The aide says, "Stays in place until final compliance, sir." The mullah nods slowly. He says, "And the uranium?" The aide says, "They want it, sir. All of it." The mullah is quiet for a long moment. He says, "And our missiles?" The aide says, "Sir, most of them are already gone." The mullah nods again. He says, "And our air defenses?" The aide says, "Also mostly gone, sir." The mullah drums his fingers on the desk. He says, "And the Navy?" The aide says, "Sir, the President of the United States said 158 vessels have been destroyed and only small fast attack boats remain." The mullah stops drumming his fingers. He just sits there in his corner for a very long time. And then he says very quietly, "Give me the pen." The aide says, "The victory speech pen, sir? Or the other one?" The mullah says, "Just get me the pen. Today we skip the victory speech. Today we just get the pen." And honestly, at this point, that is probably the smartest thing the mullahs have done in a very long time.